So now we get the United States in 1787. Alright, you see the colonies that had become states on the East Coast. You see the Northwest Territory, which is now in the process of becoming different states. And you see that these states down here have relinquished their claims to these territories, and they are now becoming territories en route to becoming states. And this is, in 1787, what is known as the frontier, the western edge of white settlement. Also, please take note that Louisiana in 1800 was ceded by Spain back to the French. So that will set up Jefferson's eventual purchase of the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon. But also remember, at this time, Spain still controls Florida all the way to the Mississippi River, which also means controlling New Orleans. Alright, so since the topic of this presentation is the Articles of Confederation, let's talk about a little bit about the economy. In some people's eyes, it was not doing well enough during what they would call this critical period, from 1781 to 1789. Alright, so if you look, basically we were importing more than we were exporting. We had what you would call a trade deficit. Alright, so the economy, internationally speaking, was not doing all that well in the eyes of many, especially merchants and the elite. And that brings us to Shays' Rebellion. Alright, so Shays' Rebellion took place from 1786 to 1787. It was led by Daniel Shays, a former Revolutionary War veteran, and it took place in western Massachusetts. And put most simply, it was small farmers who were angry by crushing debts and taxes. So let's read the notes underneath this slide here. Many prominent Americans, that is the elite, the creditors, the people who were owed money, believed the Articles of Confederation were irredeemably flawed, couldn't be fixed. First in their minds was the nation's economic crisis in the 1780s. To finance the Revolutionary War, Congress had borrowed from the people and others large sums of money by selling bonds and paying soldiers and suppliers in notes, like IOUs, to be redeemed at a later date. War bonds. So they generate war debt as a result. But without revenue, Congress was unable to pay the interest and the debts themselves. They could not collect taxes, couldn't demand taxes from the states. States whose legislative bodies were increasingly non-elite, that is, they were made up of debtors, during the Articles of Confederation, adopted their own relief measures, printing more money, postponing debt collection, passing stay laws, meaning the farm couldn't be foreclosed upon if somebody was in debt. Creditors, those who were owed the money, saw these laws as infringements on their property rights. In late 1786 and early 1787, debt-ridden farmers closed courts in western Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion, to prevent seizure of their lands for failure to pay taxes. The revolt came to be known as Shays' Rebellion, after one of its leaders, Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolutionary War. The rebels, in demanding relief and the printing of paper money, thought they were continuing the Revolution's traditions. An army organized by Massachusetts government quelled the rebellion with little violence. The revolt convinced some influential Americans that a stronger national government was needed to encourage economic growth, to protect property, and to secure law and order. Guys like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison are who thought this way. So again, to promote economic growth and secure property. Now, one man afraid of democratic excess, James Madison, a Virginian and a disciple of Thomas Jefferson, led the movement to strengthen national government. He was joined by Alexander Hamilton of New York, the most vocal advocate of a robust national government, who wanted to make the nation into a world military and commercial power. Influential economic interests, that is the elite, such as bondholders who wanted Congress to be able to generate revenue, collect taxes in order to pay them back, and urban artisans who wanted tariff protection, joined those afraid that states were violating property rights to demand a stronger national government. So artisans wanted the government to impose tariffs that would make a tariff is a tax on imports. It makes the foreign product more expensive because they've got to pay a tax to be able to be sold in this country. So it protects domestic manufacturing, and that is, at this time, urban artisans. And Shays' Rebellion scared the daylights out of the elite. It convinced them, hey, we've got to do something. So therein we get the Annapolis Convention, 1786. 12 representatives from 5 states met. Their goal was to address barriers that limited trade and commerce between the states. Not enough states were represented to make any real progress. Only 5 states were represented. So they eventually send a report to the Congress to call a meeting of all the states to meet in Philly to examine areas broader than just trade and commerce, and that becomes the Constitutional Convention. And right now I am reading from underneath here. In September 1786, delegates from 5 states met at Annapolis, Maryland, to explore new ways to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. They proposed another gathering in Philly to amend the Articles of Confederation, and Shays' Rebellion stimulated support for this plan. So remember, that was their mandate, to amend the Articles, not to trash, not to renew, not to come up with a whole new government. Alright, so now we get to the Constitutional Convention that took place in Philly. Let's look at the note underneath here. Many of the 55 men who met at the Constitutional Convention in Philly were very prominent individuals, including George Washington, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. All but one, David Brearley, was wealthy, and most were creditors. They were owed money by the government. Many men of education and great wealth, they were in their social status highly unrepresentative of most Americans. They all shared a commitment to a stronger national government and believed that democracy had gone too far. We were becoming too democratic in their eyes. They deliberated in private to ensure free and honest debate, and records of the proceedings were not published until 1840, when all the delegates were deceased. 2 notable figures not present were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. They were abroad. All delegates agreed there must be a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary, 3 branches of government, in a new national government. The new Constitution would allow Congress to raise money through direct taxes without relying on the state governments for revenue. Remember, a direct tax. The federal government would represent the people too. Even delegates who thought democracy had gone too far rejected Hamilton's proposal for a king in a House of Lords. Hamilton wanted an elected king, a person to be elected who would fulfill his or her office the same way the Supreme Court now does, for life. Debate centered on how to balance federal and state governments and the interests of small and large states. Madison's Virginia plan proposed the creation of a 2-house legislature with a state's population determining its representation in each house. Smaller states, who feared domination by the more populous states, countered with the New Jersey plan, calling for a single-house Congress in which each state cast 1 vote. They more or less wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation and just make it stronger. A compromise formed a 2-house Congress with a Senate in which each state had 2 members and a House of Representatives where members were apportioned according to a state's population. The more people in a state, the more reps you get in Congress in the House. Senators would be chosen by state legislatures every 6 years, insulating them from shifts in public opinion. Representatives were elected every 2 years directly by the people. All right, moving on. So, Federalist versus Anti-Federalist strongholds at the end of the war. We're going to go much more into the Constitution, but for now it's enough to know that they proposed it and there was going to be a period of debate. Those who were for ratification of the Constitution were Federalists. Those who were against ratification were seen as Anti-Federalists. So once the delegates approved the document, it was sent to the states to be ratified. Even though the Constitution provided that it would go into effect when 9 states had approved it, not all 13 states, as the Articles required, ratification was not certain. Each state held an election for delegates to a special statewide ratifying convention. and these elections generated intense activity. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay authored a series of 85 essays that appeared as The Federalist in 1788, something else we're going to go much more into. These three argued that the Constitution did not endanger but protected Americans' liberties. In other words, they argued you've got to give up some liberty to keep the rest. The Federalists tended to be made up of the elite, that is, lawyers, doctors, and merchants, but it was not absolute. Those who owned war bonds, they wanted to get their money, and urban artisans who needed manufacturing to be strong and again wanted a protective tariff. Those opposing ratification, called the Anti-Federalists, believed the Constitution favored power and money more than liberty. They were poorly organized and included many of the farmers who sought economic relief in the 1780s. The Anti-Federalists predicted that the new government would be controlled by merchants, creditors, and others hostile to the interests of ordinary Americans. They believed that only a small republic could succeed, not an expansive republic, as Madison argued. Liberty was the watchword of the Anti-Federalists, and they charged that the Constitution did not protect individual rights such as trial by jury or freedom of speech and the press, as did state constitutions. Anti-Federalists were generally made up mostly of the non-elite farmers, called middling folk, but were led by a rural gentry who tended to be anti-Constitution because they had the power at the state level. They were the elite, wealthier farmers. Now, it's also important to remember that these Anti-Federalists thought that they were carrying on the tradition of the Revolution. They thought that the Constitution was an abandonment of why the Patriots fought the war, and they saw themselves as protectors of the principles and values of the Revolutionary era. Pro-Constitution politics prevailed in cities and rural areas integrated into the commercial marketplace. Its strongest supporters were men of great wealth, but the promise of prosperity also appealed to urban artisans, laborers, and sailors, who thought a stronger central government would revive a lagging economy. Anti-federalism found most of its support in rural and frontier areas populated by struggling farmers. So, good luck on the quiz that will pop up right now.